Let's consider what happens when you finally stop reacting. Not with fury, not with confusion, not even with sadness, but with something much more powerful, indifference. It's subtle at first. You pull back a little. You no longer respond immediately to their provocations. You start to see through the patterns that once left you spinning. That silence, that emotional stillness, it doesn't scream, but it echoes. And for the narcissist, that echo is deafening. It's the beginning of the end. Because you have to understand this. The narcissist doesn't feed on love, they feed on reaction. Any reaction, positive or negative, doesn't matter. Rage, tears, obsession, even desperate pleading, all of it serves one purpose: to reaffirm their relevance in your emotional world. That's the lifeblood of their control. The moment you stop giving them that, when you disengage not just physically but emotionally, they feel it like a death, because in a sense it is a death. It's the collapse of a psychological ecosystem that they believed was eternal. When you detach emotionally, you're not just stepping away from the relationship, you're rejecting the reality they tried to build around you. And for someone whose entire identity is constructed on dominance and perception, that rejection is catastrophic. They realize you're no longer caught in the loop, you're no longer trying to fix it, you're no longer trying to be understood, to be seen, to be chosen. And that shift, when your energy turns inward instead of toward them, is the first undeniable sign that you're never coming back. It's critical to understand how deeply unsettling this is to the narcissist. See, they built a psychological contract, often unspoken, that said, as long as I can stir you, I own you. And that's not hyperbole. In their world, control is synonymous with identity. If they can manipulate your emotions, they exist. If they can't, they disappear. That's the level of fragility. And so when you become unmoved, not cold, not cruel, but simply free, they feel it as an existential crisis. Not just loss, but annihilation. Now, many people misunderstand what this detachment looks like. They think it's about putting up walls, being distant, or going no contact as a kind of punishment. But that's still reactionary. That's still a move made in response to them. True detachment is deeper than that. It's a shift in identity. You stop playing the role they assign to you. You stop being the caretaker, the scapegoat, the savior, the mirror. You step out of the script. And when you do that, the entire play falls apart. There's no scene left to act out. And it's here, right at this juncture, that the narcissist knows, often before you even say a word, that it's over. They'll try to test it. They'll bait you, provoke you, maybe even plead. They'll switch mask, anger, sadness, nostalgia, seduction, anything to see if they can draw the old version of you back out. But when they see that you don't flinch, don't fold, don't engage in the dance, it hits them. The power dynamic has reversed. The supply line has been cut off at the source. This moment, this quiet, unshakable knowing within you is what they feared all along. It's not your anger that terrifies them. It's your peace, your stillness, your indifference. Because now they're staring into the void they tried to fill with your attention, and it's looking back at them with silence. And here's the deeper truth. That silence, your silence, isn't a weapon. It's a resurrection. It's what happens when you reclaim the self that was buried beneath their projections. It's what happens when you realize that your energy is sacred, that your reactions are currency, and you no longer waste them on someone who seeks to deplete you. So when people ask, when does the narcissist know it's over? The answer is simple: the moment you feel nothing. Because feeling nothing isn't numbness, it's clarity. It's peace after war. It's the return to your center. And in that moment, you don't just walk away, you ascend. Let's talk about boundaries. Real boundaries. Not the kind you post about or say out loud to sound empowered. I mean the deep, internal, non-negotiable standards that arise when you finally understand your worth, not as a reaction to someone else, but as a declaration of your own integrity. That's where the narcissist runs into a wall They can't scale, manipulate, or talk their way through. See, in the beginning, they test you subtly. A joke at your expense, a passive-aggressive comment, a boundary pushed, then excused, and if you allow it, if you rationalize it, soften it, explain it away, they learn something very quickly. You're pliable. You'll bend for connection. You'll compromise for peace. And if you do it once, they'll bet everything that you'll do it again. That's how the erosion begins. Not in grand betrayals, but in the quiet moments where you abandon yourself to preserve the illusion of harmony. But there comes a point, if you're lucky, if you've done the work, if you've suffered enough, that you stop abandoning yourself. You stop giving passes. You stop folding, not out of anger, but out of clarity. You no longer mistake kindness for self-sacrifice. You understand, maybe for the first time, that saying no is a form of self-respect, not rejection. And when that no comes from a place of calm certainty rather than emotional turmoil, it signals something the narcissist is deeply unequipped to deal with: your autonomy. This is where it gets psychologically interesting, because the narcissist doesn't just want your compliance. They want your inner world. They want access to your sense of guilt, your longing for approval, your drive to please. That's where control lives. Not in the actions themselves, but in the emotional levers behind those actions. When you shift your internal landscape, when you no longer feel guilty for saying no, when your self-worth isn't up for negotiation, they lose those levers. And suddenly, their strategies fail. They push, you hold firm. They charm, you don't respond. They provoke, you don't flinch. And this confuses them deeply, not because they don't understand resistance, but because they don't expect you to embody it. Not consistently, not without a crack somewhere for them to crawl back through. And when they realize those cracks are gone, sealed by self-awareness, by boundaries rooted in your value rather than their approval, that's when it hits them. They're not dealing with the same person anymore. But it's important to understand that narcissists don't respect boundaries. They test them, they resent them, they see them as obstacles, not limits. So when you set one, they'll escalate. Not necessarily violently, but subtly, psychologically. They'll guilt trip you. They'll paint you as selfish, cold, unforgiving. They'll even play victim to pull you back into the emotional labyrinth where your empathy becomes your weakness. And if your boundaries are performative, if they're words without roots, they'll succeed. But if your boundaries are embodied, if they come from a place of deep inner alignment, they won't just protect you, they'll transform you. Because boundaries aren't walls to keep others out, they're gates that determine what deserves access to you. And when you stop allowing in what harms you, you don't just protect yourself, you redefine yourself. Now, the narcissist doesn't articulate it this way. They may not have the insight to frame it in psychological terms, but they feel it viscerally. They know instinctively when they've lost access to you, not just your time or your presence, but your vulnerability, your emotional availability, your willingness to prioritize them over yourself. That's the real loss. That's what they mourn in their own distorted way, not the relationship, the power dynamic it once afforded them. And so, when you set a boundary and keep it, when you walk away and don't look back, you're doing more than ending a relationship. You're breaking a pattern. You're asserting through action that your well-being is no longer up for debate. That's not just healing, it's rebellion against every lie you were told about what love is supposed to cost you. And that's why it terrifies them. Because once you've reclaimed yourself through boundaries, you become someone they can no longer control, predict, or diminish. You become sovereign, and to the narcissist, sovereignty is the final proof that it's over. Let's explore something that tends to confuse people, especially those who've been in close proximity to narcissists for too long. And that is the moment you stop reacting. It seems simple on the surface, maybe even trivial. But psychologically, it's one of the most profound shifts a person can undergo. And to the narcissist, it's the equivalent of the ground crumbling beneath their feet. But when you no longer react, when you meet provocation with composure, manipulation with silence, projection with clarity, that's when the dynamic begins to collapse. It's like taking oxygen away from a flame. And the narcissist feels it immediately. They may not know why. They may not be able to articulate it, but they sense the shift. You've moved from being a participant in the drama to an observer of it. You're no longer emotionally accessible in the same way. And that is profoundly unsettling to them. Let me be clear, this doesn't mean you've become cold or numb, quite the opposite. It means you've become discerning. You've stopped handing over your emotional energy to someone who distorts it for their own agenda. And that's an act of strength, an act of maturity. You're not repressing emotion, you're governing it. That's what real agency looks like. In psychological terms, you've stepped out of a reactive posture and into a responsive one. You've reclaimed the gap between stimulus and response, the space where freedom actually lives. And this space is deadly to a narcissist's influence because their entire strategy depends on closing that gap, on keeping you so emotionally charged, so off balance, that you don't even realize you're being played like an instrument. And make no mistake, narcissists are masters at playing emotion like a symphony. They know your triggers, your insecurities, your hopes. They know which buttons to push to get a rise out of you. But what happens when the buttons stop working? When the familiar script no longer gets a familiar response? They panic. Not always overtly, but internally. They'll escalate, they'll bait you harder. They might even shift strategies. Suddenly becoming the victim, the apologetic partner, the person who finally sees the light. Why? Because any reaction from you, even pity, is better than indifference, better than emotional neutrality. Because in that stillness, they no longer see themselves reflected. And that's terrifying to someone whose sense of identity is built entirely on external validation. Indifference isn't the opposite of love, it's the opposite of narcissistic supply. It means you're no longer orbiting their gravitational pull. You're no longer unconsciously negotiating your worth through their responses. You've internalized your value. And when you do that, they become irrelevant. That's what they fear the most. Not anger, not rejection, irrelevant. And I want to make something very clear here. This shift isn't just about tactics. It's not about winning the dynamic. It's about transformation. It's about healing the very parts of you that once needed their approval, their attention, even their cruelty. Because when you stop reacting, you're not just denying them something, they're losing access to a version of you that no longer exists. And that loss is absolute. So, the next time you're met with provocation, remember, your silence, your composure, your refusal to be drawn in is not weakness. It's power. Not the kind of power that dominates others, but the kind that centers you within yourself. The kind of power that says, I don't owe you my energy, I don't owe you my chaos, I owe myself peace. Something fascinating happens when you begin to rebuild your identity, piece by piece, brick by brick, outside the narcissist's control. It's not loud or dramatic at first. In fact, it often starts quietly. You start making decisions without consulting them. You stop second-guessing yourself. You trust your intuition, even when it doesn't align with their opinion. You begin to experience yourself as... And for someone who has lived under the psychological influence of a narcissist, that's revolutionary. Now, from the outside, this can seem like a normal developmental milestone, but let's not underestimate the weight of what's happening here. Because for a narcissist, your sense of self was never meant to be distinct from theirs. You were meant to mirror them, to reflect their needs, their narrative, their superiority. Your identity was absorbed into theirs, subtly, insidiously, until it became difficult to tell where they ended and you began. So when you start drawing those lines, when you begin to differentiate, to establish your own values, your own voice, your own life, you're not just reclaiming autonomy, you're dismantling their entire framework of control. This is where the existential dread starts to creep in for them. It's not just about losing you as a person, it's about losing control over how you define yourself. That's why the narcissist fight so hard to maintain the illusion of influence. They'll mock your growth, undermine your confidence, frame your independence as betrayal, because deep down they know if you no longer need their validation to feel whole, they cease to matter. Now, let's talk about the psychological mechanics of this. What we're really addressing here is the shift from an externally referenced identity to an internally grounded one. For someone enmeshed with a narcissist, identity is often shaped around survival. How do I keep the peace? How do I avoid triggering them? How do I stay worthy in their eyes? But once you realize that their approval is not the source of your value, you begin to unhook from that dependency. And that's where real growth begins. There's a concept in developmental psychology called individuation. It's the process by which a person becomes fully themselves, integrated and autonomous. Narcissistic dynamics interrupt that process. They freeze it. The narcissist doesn't want you individuated. They want you enmeshed, malleable, easily redirected. So when you begin to actualize, when you start moving towards psychological wholeness, it threatens the very foundation of the relationship. That's why your growth is perceived as rebellion. It doesn't matter how peaceful or quiet your transformation is. The narcissist reads your self-respect as defiance. Because in their world, you are not supposed to be sovereign. You are supposed to be a function of their ego. You are supposed to revolve around them. So when you stop orbiting, the center collapses, and they feel that collapse viscerally. But here's the irony. This moment, the one they dread the most, is also the moment you begin to live. Because autonomy is not isolation, it's not the rejection of connection, it's the foundation of healthy connection. You can't love freely when your identity is imprisoned. You can't give authentically when you're giving from fear. So what the narcissist calls selfishness is actually the beginning of true relational integrity. You're no longer performing, you're showing up as a whole person. And that changes everything. You start making choices aligned with your values, not their expectations. You pursue goals that fulfill you, not just what keeps them happy. You speak truth even when it disrupts the illusion. And, most importantly, you stop apologizing for existing. That's the exact moment they realize it's over. Not because you said so, not even because you left, but because you no longer belong to them. You belong to yourself. And for someone who built their sense of power on your submission, that's not just a loss. That's annihilation.